this event. So.
All right, cool. Thank you, Dr. Kells. I believe it's recording. Yeah, it's recording. Okay, let me introduce Dr. Cristina Ramirez. It's my privilege to introduce Dr. Ramirez, an accomplished professor and program director for the Rhetoric, Composition, and Teaching of English and graduate program at the University of Arizona, with a PhD in English, specializing in rhetoric and writing studies from the University of Texas at El Paso. Dr. Ramirez has made significant strides in the field since completing her doctorate in 2010. Her research not only examines rhetorical practices, but also works to expand the understanding of writing studies in both historical and contemporary contexts. Dr. Ramirez's leadership within academia is complemented by her commitment to mentoring graduate students, guiding them in their developing their own scholarly voices. As an advocate for underrepresented voices in rhetoric, she also explores the themes of cultural identity, linguistic diversity, and the intersections of gender and race within writing practices. Her contributions have shaped discussions around language and power, making her a prominent figure in rhetoric and composition studies. And I will pass it off to Dr. Ramirez.
Jasmine, thank you so much. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you also for those of you who are here this afternoon on a Friday. And thank you, Dr. Michelle Kells, for this invitation. I would not have missed this for the world, really. Actually, right now, just a quick correction, I am chair or head of the English department at University of Arizona. I was program director, but now I'm steering the whole ship now. Before I begin, I want to point out the picture that I have back here. Does anyone recognize this artist? It's huge. It's actually pretty big. It's a Rudolph Carl Gorman. It's an original print. He was a Native American artist of the Navajo Nation. He was actually born in Chinle, Arizona, near Canyon de Chelly, but then he moved to Albuquerque, New Mexico, and he passed away in 2005. And so if you all are wondering, sometimes people ask me, they're like, oh, and someone actually said one time, is that a Gorman? I was really surprised that someone knew, but that's who I have here behind me. So welcome, everyone. I'm excited to talk to you all about the Chicana Feminist Research Methods y también en español, recuperando las voces de nuestras abuelas. And I'll talk to you about all of this research methods, recuperando todo esto as we move along. I'm actually going to start with some of my own history because when I'm speaking to graduate students, I like for students to hear my path to scholarship. So I didn't get like go from my bachelor's to my master's and then my PhD. I graduated originally with my bachelor's in '94 and went straight into the classroom. I taught middle school reading and writing for many years. And I was teaching at a time where there was no computers, no cell phones. I actually miss those days. It was, I think back on that now and I'm like, wow, what a time to have been teaching. And I've been able to see the revolution of pedagogy. But when I was teaching texts, I started, really living we'll say, some of the theories that we're writing about now in terms of inclusion, in terms of representation. But I was seeing this play out in the classroom. And students, and I started to see that my students, because I taught at Henderson Middle School. Henderson Middle School is 1.32 miles from the frontera, from the Mexican border, from the Cesar Chavez border freeway in El Paso. So 98.2% of my students were Mexican American or Mexicanos, straight from Juarez. And I remember it was a text that I was teaching, "A Day No Pigs Would Die." And I don't necessarily have anything. It's an excellent book. It's about a young adolescent boy with his pig. But that I remember this was like the second book that I was teaching, and the students were just so disconnected. And I was, from a very, I would say, even patriarchal, Eurocentric perspective, I was seeing, well, why aren't they liking this book? Why, what's up? And so I had a conversation with them, and I said, I just kind of made it real. I put our books down, and they're like, we don't like this book. And there was a time when you said, okay, you're going to have to read this book, whether you like it or not. But I made the decision, and I kind of threw that book out like right in the middle. And I went down to the book room to see what was there available for these students that was more representative of them. And I found Sandra Cisneros. I found what's his name, Soto. And I said, I need to teach students literature in where they see themselves. And so this is I love these images because it's a young girl just kind of disappearing. And I understood this 30 years ago, not through reading theory, but through living this in the classroom, that I began to understand that people, readers, students, no le hace quien, it doesn't matter. And for centuries, it's been women who do not see themselves represented in the greater historical and or literary narrative begin to erase themselves. They erase themselves as if they do not exist or do not count among what they are learning. Their lives are then lived on the margins or in the shadows. And so I double, what I say here with, if young girls, and I saw this especially in the middle school, if young girls or women read and hear enough of men's lives, their adventures, travels, posts, books, speeches, she herself begins to understand that her place in society is one of absence. That is to say that she is not part of the culture, not heard, and not represented. And so I understood this before I started reading any sort of feminist theory. And so when I picked up feminist theory in grad school, and it wasn't until it was my in the PhD program that I picked up these kinds of theories. Right before the PhD program, I started a novel. And this novel, it was to be an adolescent novel on young girls. And this is the plot. I still haven't written the book. Someday, maybe I will. But the young girl was a student at El Paso High. And her grandmother, her abuela, abruptly moves in with them from Mexico. I say Zacatecas or Chihuahua. And this regularly happens in the Mexican culture, is the abuela will move in, and who is displaced? La niña, right? The young girl is displaced. She either sleeps with abuela or shares a room with abuela, right? This has really historically been the case. And so here I'm telling the plot of the book that I haven't written. And so at school, she's asked to interview a veteran of war. but she doesn't realize that her nana, her abuela, at home, living with her in the same room, had actually been a soldadera. And so I kind of started writing this text, but when I got to writing about the soldaderas, I'm like, espera, I don't know anything about soldaderas. And so I went to the library. This was the summer before I started the PhD program in 2005 or 6, something like that. And in the mainstream history of the Mexican Revolution, I could not find anything about women in the revolution. And so I had to do a little bit deeper dive. And I found this book. This book changed my life. Emergence of the Modern Mexican Woman, Her Participation in Revolution and Struggle for Equality from 1910 to 1940. Shirlene Soto was a professor at UNM for many years. She's passed away. But this book changed my life. You see this representation that I have here of this child reading the book? That's exactly what I did. I went home y esa tarde me llevé el libro a casa y en la noche realmente me comí el libro, página por página, page by page. And through this, I saw una realidad que se desdobló. It unfolded for me, and I was just like, oh my gosh. What Shirlene Soto did here was she was writing a history of women, of revolutionary women. And at the end of each chapter, she wrote about women, Mexican women writers, mujeres mexicanas escritoras, pero periodistas, women journalists. And that's where these women grabbed me and they said, this is what you're going to do. And this is what you're going to study. And I was entranced. I didn't want to read, Michelle, you will believe this. I didn't want to read any of the other theory. I didn't want to read theory on writing studies. I mean, estas mujeres me pusieron un hechizo. And I was like this, I didn't want to read anything else. So when I started graduate school, I was hungry. I realized that this was a hunger to learn about my ancestors. And so I directed my research to learn more about them. And these ancestors are not always blood. It's not always de nuestra sangre, right? Ancestors constitute men and women who created a space for me, you, and us to be doing the work in which we are engaged. And so scholars or Chicana writers like Cherie Moraga, who is actually just retiring this year, and Gloria Zaldúa, they talk about the theory of the flesh. And Cherie really goes into some complicated language with the theory of the flesh. And I kind of didn't understand it, but now that I've engaged in this kind of theory, what does that mean? To be engaging in the theory of the flesh just means that we research and write our truths. When we do, that flesh is made whole and material in the form of discourse. And my research has started from my flesh. And so here are 3 texts that I have published so far. Occupying Our Space is my first text. That was my dissertation, and where I recover Mexican women writers, and it's only Mexican women. And I write their history, and I theorize about puestos, places where they stand. The second one is Mestiza Rhetorics, in which I anthologize 33 Mexican and Mexican-American women writers in dos idiomas, in Spanish and in English. There's one woman in there from New Mexico, and I edited this with Jessica Enoch. And then my last book that just came out recently, A Story of Stories, and I really hope that you all get it and read it. So just really quickly, here's, I'm not going to focus on these books because I'm going to go into really some of the research methods. But here is some of what I worked with when I was working with these texts. Here's a list of all the 33 women, or actually 33 texts. I think there's 30 women with 33 texts. This is the table of contents, and I sent you that flyer. And here on the right, you see an example of some of the primary texts that I was dealing with. I was using digital archives, but what I also did is I pulled an Indiana Jones move, and I hopped on a bus in Ciudad Juarez, and I went down looking for Juana Belén Gutiérrez de Mendoza. She's number over here on the table of contents. I went looking for her in Durango, and I certainly found her, and I found some texts these were in non-digitized archives, but then I've also switched over to digitized archives. And here's an important point that I'm making about these here, is that this recovery work that I'm doing, and then maybe some of you are going to end up doing textual, visual, and even musical of Chicana, Chicano, Chicanx lived realities, is vital to the shifting of historical realities and the preservation of lost voices. Archival projects that are the driving force of this preservation and recovery project. And here's some, if you are not aware of some of these archives, you want to write these down and find them. One is the U.S. Hispanic Recovery Project. It's out of Houston. They are thriving and doing extremely well. They have two archives, the Arte Público Hispanic Historical Collection Series 1, and that should be 2, but they also have digital collections online that they are funding, and I got some of that funding to do some of that work. The University of Texas at Austin, the Nettie Lee Benson Latin American Collection, they have some online, but really the Hispanic Recovery Project has surpassed, I'm going to say, has surpassed the UT Austin collection. I don't know if they're close, they're neck and neck. And then here's some other collections that you might want to look into on databases, is the American Historical Newspapers. And here's a description of what they have within their digital archive, covering from 1960 to 1922, historical newspapers from Arizona, New Mexico, and they have a sub-archive of the Hispanic American newspapers from 1808 to 1980. If this is the kind of work that you want to do, start delving into these. And even if this is not the work that you want to do, this is where you can find cutting edge raw historical data in the primary texts. And then there's another one, Latino literature, poetry, drama, and fiction. So let me see, oh, yes. So in the spirit of storytelling, so I told you a little bit about some of the archives that I looked into for my first two projects. But then my third project came along while I was actually writing. It was my first book. I thought it was my second book, but they overlapped. So what I have done is I have turned my research to my roots of family and literacy. So I go from nuestras abuelas, and I literally go to mi abuela, to the roots of my family literacy, writing, and understanding the intersections with border and barrio history. My grandmother in 1974 published in the most influential Chicano literary journal of the Chicano movement. Rodolfo Anaya, some of the other big names, I don't know why they're, Rodolfo Anaya, he wrote Bless mi última y luego no me tragó la tierra. I can't, his name is not coming to me right now. But my grandmother published with these writers from the 70s. And so if you look here, Ramona Gonzalez, that's my grandmother. And I knew that she had been a Chicana writer, but I learned this when I was 19 years old. And when you're 19, things they don't always click and enter. And I was living with her at that time. And so what I did when I started this project, and we found all 750 pages of her writings, what I did before I started the project is I wrote an article about the original findings, and I theorized exactly what I found. And if you scan this QR code up here, it will take you directly, it'll give you the PDF of Rhetorical Herencia. That should be actually, the title is not from Rhetorical Herencia, but this is an article, Rhetorical Herencia, Writing Toward a Theory of Rhetorical Recovery and Transformation, that I published in Latinx Writing and Rhetoric Studies in 2020. So I'm going to read actually some of these, because this is exactly, I articulated exactly what I was doing with this theory of the flesh. So academically speaking, I am a feminist rhetorical history recovery scholar, just like I've shown you my work. Personally speaking, I am the maternal granddaughter of Doña Ramona Gonzalez, a published Chicana writer from the 1970s, whose texts, history, and herencia I aim to rescue, recover, and preserve. So in 2020, I had not gotten to this yet. Importantly, her writings also document the importance of memory, recovery, and preservation. Her writings ground my research, which is part of my own rhetorical herencia. I began theorizing rhetorical herencia through my journey of recovering my abuela's writings. Herencia is heritage, that which is left or given to you. In the summer of 2014, I completed my first manuscript of Occupying Our Space, which you all seen as a feminist recovery project, and highlights the writings of rhetorical history of Mexican women rhetors. While I was writing the manuscript, I got a phone call. Well, before the phone call, my family made an archival recovery of our own, an old cardboard box containing over 750 pages of my maternal grandmother, Ramona Gonzalez's writings. So, to give you the significance of this is sometimes we find abuela's writings or tia's writings, and they're on like a notebook or something like this. But these were complete and total manuscripts that we found. And I opened the box, and I almost couldn't believe what I was seeing. And the rest of my family was thinking, well, ¿qué vamos a hacer con todo eso? What are we going to do with this? And I said, I know exactly what to do with these. So her works, written mostly in Spanish, escribió en español, which is very also significant and interesting, were produced during the Chicano movement of the late 1960s and early 70s in El Paso, Texas. Later that year, my father and I would begin the slow and laborious process of preserving them through digitization and later translating them into English. One afternoon, while writing the conclusion to Occupying Our Space, my father called and asked, so a little bit of background on my father. My father is Neil Devereaux. That's where I get the Devereaux. But my father has his PhD in Spanish linguistics and Hispanic literatures in 1971 from UT Austin. And he's been translating texts, literary texts, governmental texts now for over 50 years. And he was starting the process actually of reading through some of these documents before I did. But one afternoon while I was writing on my first book, he called and he said, "Can I read you a piece your grandmother wrote?" And I dropped everything and I put everything down. And giving him all my attention, I listened and he read the introduction to a piece she wrote titled Picos y Tolondrones para todos los preguntones. We understand in our family that there is really no translation to Picos y Tolondrones. And she writes, this is her writing. I clipped off a piece of her writing and I published it. La cultura chicana es rica. Por lo consiguiente, su literatura es rica. Son ricas porque es una mezcla de la hispana, indígena, mexicana y un regado de anglo-sajano. A la cultura que más nos apegamos es la indígena mexicana, cuya mezcla le llamamos chicana aquí en los Estados Unidos americanos. La revolución en esta cultura se trata de no dejarla desaparecer, aunque existe en la mayoría de los nacidos en los Estados Unidos. Esta está oculta por varias razones. Y ahora es el tiempo de ponerla a luz, de enseñarla y de tener orgullo en ella. I don't know the exact date that she wrote this, but it was probably like 1972. I was 1 year old. She writes, Chicano culture is rich, so it follows that its literature is rich. They are rich because they are a mixture of Hispanic, Indian, Mexican, and a sprinkling of Anglo-Saxon cultures. The culture that we are most attached to is the Indian Mexican, the mixture of what we call Chicano here in the United States. The revolution, and at that time it was a revolution that was happening. In this culture is about not letting it disappear. Although it exists in the majority of those born in the United States, it is hidden for several reasons. And now it is time to bring it into the light, to lift it up, and to have pride in it. So here my father is reading this to me while I am writing a text on the recovery of Mexican women writers. Hearing Doña Ramona's words delivered in my father's eloquent Spanish, I froze. From beyond the grave, my grandmother was speaking directly to me. Her words, written more than 45 years ago, validated my writing and gave deeper meaning to my recovery work. In this piece, an introduction to over 95 pages of dichos. Yes, she wrote 95 pages, if not more, 95 pages of dichos, and then also their defining the dichos. Doña Ramona frames the importance of recovering the Chicano and Mexican mestizo culture by recovering the stories of our ancestors from our own memories and calling upon members of our community to help construct that knowledge. Expressing an early understanding of Chicanismo. My grandmother was in the heart of the Chicano movement. Doña Ramona's concepts from Picos y Tolondrones and other of her writings with regard to historical discovery, discursive recovery, pride in our culture's history, and memory have come to frame my understanding of the work I and others do as rhetorical scholars. which I call rhetorical herencia. Herencia means heritage, or that which is an integral part of you by birthright, such as culture, language, and traditions. So here's just an example of, some of the documents that we found. And if you want to scan that QR code, I believe that QR code will take you to some of these documents. And I like to say this, that en español, que cada página era una pieza literaria original escrita a máquina. These are examples of my grandmother's texts. Al abrir aquella caja de verduras, it was a vegetable box, y ver los montones de escritos de mi abuela, nuestra familia supo que teníamos algo importante y significativo, incluso mágico, en nuestro poder. So this is just a few pages that are an example of our texts, the texts that we discovered. So if you scan this down here, I believe it'll take you to the Ramona Gonzalez papers, and we're going to look at those in just a second, because I'm going to tell you the research methods that I undertook to legitimize everything that my grandmother was doing. So I had 750 pages of her writings. And how do I take that and legitimize it? And that was a process in itself, from docs in a book to actual scholarship. So her writings lived in a box for probably 35 years. And this is, I'm like, ay, no lo puedo creer that we didn't take pictures of that initial moment. Probably the excitement y todo. And I first labeled her writings as in the estate of the Devereux Hernandez. It should be actually Devereux Hernandez Gonzalez estate. That's how I was first labeling them, okay? But then this is where I really got some ground, is I received a fellowship, a research grant here from the University of Arizona. And that course release allowed me time to start digitizing the documents and labeling them, looking at them. It was an immense undertaking. I have been turned down for 2 NEH grants. So we scanned all of the documents. And what I learned is that this is a digital humanities method too. And then this was the big breakthrough for me, is I got a research fellowship from the University of Houston with the U.S. Hispanic Recovery Project. And writing those NEH grants and framing grants they take a lot of time to write, and I'd be more than happy to share, Michelle, to share these grants and how I wrote them up. And I articulated it. This is where I was first articulating the project, what I imagined, the significance of my grandmother's writings. And I worked and worked at those, and was really sad when I didn't get either of the NEH grants. But with the grant that I got from the University of Houston, it's a Mellon grant, I got the Ramona Gonzalez papers. And so if you Google just the Ramona Gonzalez papers, it will come up. And let me see if it'll take me to that. Oh, yes, I'm seeing the Ramona Gonzalez papers. So just to show you what I did here is I put her writings online. Por vida de estas Santas Cruces, that is one of the texts that I recover in here. What I've done here is in this archive, I've given them a Dublin Core Dublin Core, name and number, okay, title. And this means that they're searchable, okay? The title, Por vida de estas santas cruces, yo viví en estos barrios, that's the title of this piece. The subject, Mexican-American border region in literature, Mexican-American women, Mexican-American neighborhoods, Mexican-American women in literature, the description, and then you can come down here and we have the entire text. We have the entire text. So what I did here took a tremendous amount of time. But now, so this is what I mean, that her texts went from texts in the box or docs in the box to now a very legitimate space, okay? And I had tried to start the book before I did this, but it wasn't going to fly. I couldn't do it. After, or it was during the time that I was working on the digitized project, I told my family, this was sticky. It was sticky con mi familia. I reached out to my tia first and my mom and dad, and I said, these papers should not be under your desk. These papers should be preserved at a special collections. And we donated them after, discusiones con la familia, discussions with family, as you can imagine. We donated them to the Latin American Benson collection at UT Austin, where they should have been. And because I was able to articulate, I took the time to articulate exactly what my grandmother's history, textual history was, and where it intersected with Chicana literary history. When I told that to them in the email, they responded, it was like 5 minutes, you all. They said, you know, the last sentence said, are you all interested in these papers? Oh my God, yes, we want these papers. And then we sent the papers to them, and the director called and he said, we are floored as to how well these texts are preserved. And so that was the work that I was doing, the background work that I was doing to legitimize my grandmother's writings. So here's a picture of my grandmother. This picture now is 100 years old. This is my grandmother at El Paso High, and she was born in Barrio Chihuahuita, and I'm going to tell you where that is. They're in South El Paso, and she graduated from El Paso High in 1925. Next week, I'm going and talking to about 100 students there at El Paso High. I am so excited to go talk to these students. And I found that in the yearbook called The Spur. So Chihuahuita is in South El Paso, and it's actually in 2016, it was designated by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. So you see all these historic, significant things that started to add up into a very larger, significant historical thing. Cosa, proyecto, project, identified Barrio Chihuahuita as one of America's 11 most endangered historic spaces in 2016 in their annual report. And this gave me even more, we'll say, legitimizing information in these grants when I would write them, because they'd be like, well, where's Chihuahuita? Who's, you know, where is this place? But then when I added the National Trust for Historic Preservation, that really gave it a whole different frame. And here's another view of exactly where Chihuahuita is. Here's El Paso. This is like at the very edge, you know, where Texas comes down like this, the very edge. And here's Segundo Barrio, Barrio Chihuahuita. And you can see right here that it's right along the Rio Grande. And few Texas neighborhoods can claim a centuries-long line of international politics that encompassed a revolution, geographic upheaval from mass immigration, and overhyped fear and propaganda against its residents. So here's some other pictures. This picture is 1913. This is where my grandmother lived, here in Barrio Chihuahuita. The mountain right behind you, that's the Franklin Mountains. Here's my grandmother in 1913. And then what was so awesome about this project is that my family, we had all the pictures. We had everything collected. And I was just having to put the pieces together, which sounds easy, but it wasn't. And then in 1938, this picture was taken in 38. That's what my mom remembers. But in 1934, my abuela and my abuelo, Manuel Gonzalez from Zacatecas, they opened a corner grocery store in the middle of the Depression in El Paso. And they had the grocery store up front and they lived in the back. It is no longer there because it was eminent domained by Texas. And that's where the exit to downtown El Paso is now. So it's a good thing that we had pictures and images of that. How much time do I have, Michelle?
Yeah, about 5 minutes.
About 5 minutes, okay.
And
So
then 5 minutes for questions, comments.
okay.
This is so rich. I wish we had another hour.
If you all can give me a little bit of time to read. So the first story that I recover is called Por vida de estas santas cruces yo viví en estos barrios. And I'm going to read to you, not from there, but from what I wrote. The foreword is written by Norma Elia Cantú. If you know Chicana literary writing right now, she is at the forefront of the Chicana literary movement. And so I'm actually going to end with reading a poem that I wrote about my grandmother 20 years before I found these documents, or that I even knew that I was going to be writing about my grandmother. And the introduction, just one paragraph, and it says, Abuela, si estás aquí. This is the introduction. Literacy practices, oral traditions, and storytelling frame the way we identify, create, and interpret our worlds. These ways of knowing are passed on to family, storytelling at the dinner table, in the intimacy of the living room, and at the bedside. Doña Ramona González, my maternal grandmother, knew the power of words and wrote down her memories and thoughts for the benefits of future generations. Doña Ramona's legado, or legacy, for her family and for the community that can now enjoy her writings, emphasizes the passing of cultural literacy from one generation to the next. Nearly 50 years before I learned of my grandmother's writings, 15, I attempted to capture my comprehension of her literacy transmission in the poem Abuela. So in 2001, 6 years after my grandmother's death in 95, this poem was published in the El Paso literary journal called Border Senses. Little did I know that my words foretold of un gran plato servido con palabras, grand plate served with words, one that my family would one day uncover. Here's the poem, Abuela. The fragile days I spent with you have broken into a million pieces. No estás aquí. I can hear your cuentos y dichos in my mind, like echoes through a canyon. The memories mix with the smell of guiso y calabazas. Your wisdom is the first sign of spring on a winter afternoon. It too resides in me. Before, I would not let the wisdom in. I thought it to be old-fashioned, like a song that no one sings anymore. Abuela, me has dejado un gran plato servido con palabras de tu juventud. Abuela, I feel you now, como el sol en las espaldas de una mujer sin blusa. I embrace you now like a child embraces her mother for the last time. Abuela, si estás aquí. The poem's last line, Abuela, si estás aquí, reflects the tangible quality of my grandmother's writings that are now in our possession. While this line acknowledges her influence in the present moment, I ask, where is aquí, the here? As an extension of ourselves, the practice of writing in poems, essays, short stories, and more gives our conscious selves a permanence in the material realm. This is what I mean by making the flesh material. Doña Ramona's words anchor the thematic foundation of her writings and life's work, which by her wisdom were preserved. This collection of her selected writings tells the treasure, el tesoro, she left our family and you, her contemporary reader. Thank you.
Cristina, I'm just going to jump in because your book is such